Welcome back to Dichotomology. Today I'm going to go over more in depth, at least, and also to clarify the understanding of personality when it comes to true dichotomies, personality and morality itself. So both of these are pretty much integrated in all the other aspects of dichotomology as well when it comes to the human aspects, like intuitionism versus rationalism, conservatism versus liberalism, and many, many others. So whenever you think of the part of the human aspect of this is in terms of personality and morality, like so the true dichotomies within those two aspects of humanity. And we'll start with bell curves. So humans, almost all of our traits lie on bell curves. And this is because the extremes have been selected for, or against, I guess you could say, by nature and by civilizations and by people. So everything that is on these bell curves has been put pressure on by the extremes. So once I go over I'm going to list the traits, and then I'm going to give you examples of the extremes of each. So bell curves, almost all human traits lie on bell curves. This normal distribution is the result of selective pressures on each side of the environment at each extreme. This shows us the more extreme that a trait, the more likely there is to be a detrimental effect to individual's health or ability to survive. For example, if you're too tall or too short, each can present in their own medical issues. Like if you're too tall, your heart can't handle pumping blood. It's harder for you to move because different parts of your body aren't quite able to keep up with a lot of the problems that you have now when it comes to like how long your arms are, etc. So it's much easier to comprehend when you go all the way to the extreme. Like what's the tall person we've ever had, and they didn't live very long. And the same for like the shortest short person. So like someone who came out extremely tiny, they just weren't able to survive. And there's people that are on the fringes that are barely surviving and they barely eke out an existence. And it's not to say there's anything like necessarily inherently wrong with them. This is just the extremes of true dichotomies of each one of these human characteristics that has been selected for by reality itself. So we can't get away from it. We can't escape that the extremes will be selected against. So any extreme, we found that it's wrong. It's not feasible, and it's not something we should aim for. So we need to stay away from the extremes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we should try to find an exact middle, depending on how you look at it. Because obviously I would say the average person is the ideal person. Like that's who we should aim to be like. But at the same time, each one of these things is going to have a different spot. So like the overall person, the average person is what I think we should aim for. Like they are the homeostasis of what nature has selected for. But there's going to be different contexts in which it might be slightly better to have a different personality, which is why, we still have wider or more narrow bell curves in which their traits lie. So the same is true for personality traits and moral foundations. So we must stay away from the extremes in order to understand it. We also need to rationalize the extremes. So I'm going to do my best to rationalize the extreme for each of the 5 personality traits. And I think there's 6 moral foundations in moral foundations theory. There used to be 5, but now there's 6. And, in the end, it's really just about understanding the extremes of each one. So this is what a bell curve looks like. And the further you go out, the less people there will be. So this is a measurement of y-axis is how many people lie there, or percentage of population, etc. And then the x-axis is the degree to which they have that trait. So like as you go further and further to the left, like you could say this would be tall versus short. So as you go further to the left, you're going to have less and less people that are going to be shorter and shorter. And then to the right, you're going to have less and less people that are taller and taller. But so if you look at the middle, this is where the average person is, and the average is always going to have the most. Well, not always, but it's more or less where the majority of people are on average. Okay. So, openness to experience is the first trait. So I just remember, I memorize 5 personality traits as ocean because it's an actual word and it's easy to remember. So it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the first one we'll go over is openness. So a high extremely high openness involves an intense curiosity and desire for novel experiences, creative thinking, and willingness to embrace unconventional ideas. Characteristics include imaginative, creative, and constantly seeking new intellectual and artistic pursuits. They are often deeply engaged in philosophical or abstract thinking. So they like new concepts, they like new ideas to incorporate into this holistic understanding of the way the world works. So you can almost say higher openness is almost associated with more right brain thinking or right brain dominant thinking. So if you're very hardcore right brain, you could say at least part of that is trying to connect all these ideas together or learn new ideas so you can either simplify it into your framework or get a more holistic understanding of everything. Depending on which one you're aiming towards is which brain is dominant. So if you're aiming towards like a simplification, you want these new ideas so you can simplify the world more and make it more simple, more rationalized, then I would say your pursuit is for the wrong aims. And then you should be trying to incorporate all the ideas you can into a broader understanding of reality. But this comes as consequences. Like if you're extremely right hemispheric, let's say, or you're extremely high in openness, you have a difficulty focusing on practical tasks and maintaining stable routines. You struggle with consistency in your life. You want to constantly change jobs. You want to constantly change interests. And you may seem as eccentric or impractical. And you might face challenges in environments that require conformity and adherence to established norms or repetitive tasks. Like someone who's extremely high in openness could never, like they would die if they worked at like a factory where they were doing repetitive tasks over and over again. So now let's go to the opposite end. So a very extremely low open person would involve a rigid adherence to tradition, a traditional way of thinking, resistance to change, and a preference for familiar routines. I would say this is more left-brain thinking. So it's like more systematized, it's more structured, it's hard to change, and it doesn't like change. So if you're extremely low, it would involve rigid adherence to traditional, like I was saying, resistance to change, and a preference for familiar routines. And then characteristics of this would be individuals are conventional, practical, and skeptical of new ideas. They favor tried and true methods and are often conservative in their thinking. So it makes sense that somebody who's lower in openness would be more conservative. But so they would be more left brain thinking, right? In this aspect, which is interesting because there's a weird interplay of the dynamic of left versus right brain thinking between conservatives and liberals. And I'm still trying to hash it out. And I can go over that in another video, but it seems to be like whatever brain your both hemispheres are in service to. So if you're conservative, you're like, okay, it's in service to this abstract, holistic way of thinking, and that would be my religion or my tradition or whatever connects me in relationship with other people. Whereas liberals are like, my right holistic brain is in service to simplification, science, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to probably update my other video on conservatives versus liberals when I start to hash this out more and more, but it's starting to make more sense as I keep thinking about it. So the consequences of having this extreme point of view would be that they lack creativity and innovation. And this makes sense because most entrepreneurs are liberals and left people on the left. It's kind of weird how it ends up being like, if you think with one side of the mind, like in service to it, you're actually worse at that way of thinking. So like in being so left hemispheric, individuals who are liberals are bad at managing systems. And then if you're more right hemispheric in nature, and that's that's your main way of looking at the world, you're worse at abstract thinking and coming up with new novel understanding of the world. So these two ways of thinking are opposites, and you get the opposite both motivation and ability to manage. So it's like this is where the yin and yang aspect comes in. It's like, if I'm right brain thinking, I'm actually worse at coming up with new novel ideas. And if I'm left brain thinking, then I'm worse at managing things. And you'd be like, what? That doesn't make any sense. It's like, this is the brain that's systematizing things. It's making things structured and stuff. But I don't know the reason for this, but it seems to be that's the thing that's happening, which is extremely interesting. And I think that eventually we'll figure it out. Maybe it's like you're using it so much it's tired, and the other brain is like hyper underactivated. It's almost like you're an adrenaline junkie and you don't go out and do something for a while. Your body's just going to release that adrenaline, and you're going to be like super anxiety prone. It's like not using something for a while that you really need to have an urge to use, and then you just release a bunch of it. So that's how I kind of view it, is like, if you're using that hemisphere dominantly most of the time, it's going to get tired out, and the other one's just going to be pumped and ready to go. It's already going to have all of its energy reserved. And then it's just going to boom. It's going to be spontaneous bursts of that side of your thinking, rather than the sustained, constant way that you think about the world. So in being left brain and having that left brain perspective, you're just going to tire it out all the time. It's like it's kind of like it's operating on like a constant mode, whereas the other one's like, boom, here's a new idea. And then if you're left brain thinking, it's like, boom, here's a new idea, a concept that's popping in your head because you're not using me, so I'm like kind of doing some background work. And on the other side, if you're really holistic thinking all the time, you're thinking about all the connections between things, all of a sudden you're going to see the ways, like your left hemisphere is not doing as much work, so it sees the lack of systematic observation in the world. It's like, oh, this needs to be in order. This needs to be in order. So it's like, it's so sensitive to it now that whenever you see it, it becomes something you want to engage with. It becomes like, I see a messy desk. I need to fix that, because it's so sensitive now because it wants to be utilized. So that's how it makes sense to me. So then you have conscientiousness. So we went over openness. We have conscientiousness. So a high extreme of conscientiousness is defined as extremely high, intense focus on organization, dependability, and goal-oriented behavior. Characteristics include disciplined individuals, meticulous and reliable. They excel in planning, follow through, and achieving long-term goals. This extreme can lead to a perfectionism, a workaholic individual, causing stress and burnout. Such individuals can become overcritical of themselves and others and struggle to relax or enjoy leisurely activities. They also might have a difficulty adapting to spontaneous changes or being flexible. So this also makes sense. This is another thing in which it has predictability when it comes to whether or not you're conservative or liberal. And you're more conservative if you're of this extremely high conscientious nature. And again, for the same reasons I listed just now, is that your systematized way of thinking isn't being accessed. So it's like, when you're thinking about the connections and relationship between everything so much as your primary mode of thinking, again, it's going to make you want these other things. It's going to make you desire the opposite. It's almost like the same reason why females who are more right brain are attracted to people who are more left brain. And you also see this in lesbian couples. Like, you could say is one of the individuals is always left brain, and one of them is always more masculine, you could say, because of that difference in perspective. One is more left brain thinking, one is more right brain thinking. I've seen this in lesbian couples, and my neighbor is one, and they have this different way. I can tell just by talking to them that they have this different way of perceiving the world, and like, one is more masculine, one's in the military, one's takes care of the children, and it's like they both have this left versus right hemispheric perspective, and that's what people mostly look for in a mate when it comes to a female, whereas males look for the physical characteristics. So that's another difference. That's interesting. But anyways, I keep digressing because this personality stuff and morality maps directly onto what we find in a free society like the United States, where people are able to think freely and come to their own conclusions. And now we've more or less coalesced around the different hemispheric ways of thinking. So that's the liberal left and the conservative right. So, I mean, obviously you have other parties, but I would say they're tangential, and they're more of like a resistance to an ardent, like the other one is really libertarianism, which has any like grounding, and they're more of a resistance to an extreme perspective on each side. It's like if you're right and you become too extreme, like liberals won't like you. If you're left and you're too extreme, libertarians won't like you. Sorry if I said liberals instead. So that's kind of the difference there. And extremely high conscientiousness involves focus on organization depending on the way. Okay, so we went over all this, and the consequences are obviously not good. So you don't want to be extremely conscientious. And on the low end, you involve lack of organization, discipline, and reliability. Individuals are spontaneous and easygoing and may struggle maintaining focus, meeting deadlines. They often act on impulses and have a relaxed approach to life. This extreme can lead to procrastination, missed opportunities, and failure to achieve important goals. Such individuals may be perceived as irresponsible or unreliable and struggle in environments requiring structure and consistency. So this is more or less similar to high and low openness, right? Because if you're in that systematic area, you're going to die because you're not interested at all, and your brain is just going to feel numb. Whereas if you're engaging in that approach and you're low in consciousness and low in openness, you're just going to feel even worse, because now you have no motivation to do this and you have no interest in doing it. So both of those things together is just going to destroy you. So if you're extremely high in openness and extremely low in conscientiousness, you need a job that's very flexible and constantly changing. So if that is you need to seek therapy, because like there's not very many jobs for you, and you're likely not going to end up meeting your needs when it comes to your personality and mapping it onto the world. But at the same time, it's like you can, over time, I wouldn't say you can like move them drastically across the personality bell curve, but what seems to be the case is you can slightly widen it to allow you to be more adaptable to different situations. And let's say you're all the way at the extreme, well, you kind of want to widen it more to the right so you can be adaptable, mostly in that aspect of being more conscientious. So extremely high conscientious, bad. Extremely low conscientiousness, bad. Extroversion. So extremely high extroversion involves a constant need for social interaction, stimulation, and excitement. Individuals are outgoing, energetic, and thrive on social settings. They're often the center of attention and are very expressive. This extreme can lead to impulsive behavior, difficulty spending time alone, and inability to reflect inwardly. Such individuals may struggle with introspection and become dependent on external validation. They may also have a difficulty in environments where that requires solitude, focused, and independent work. So obviously, like I've been doing a lot of writing, and I can tell I'm not as extroverted, I would say, as the average person, or maybe slightly less than. But I do enjoy the presence of people sometimes as well, but it just drains me over time. But for someone who's highly extroverted, they thrive on that energy from the outward world. They thrive on the energy from everybody else. And in doing so, it's a benefit and a curse, because now you rely on that. If you ever get separated from that, then it's going to destroy you. So you need to be able to be adaptable. You need to make sure you don't go too extreme when it comes to your external need for validation. So these people are probably going to be individuals that seek that, you could say spirituality. Like if you're extremely extroverted, you're focused on all the external validation, which might make you more materialistic. And in doing so, you see the consequences of that, and you're going to seek that spiritual aspect. So I'm not sure if I would associate with left hemispheric thinking, but it can definitely have that bias that leads you to that left hemispheric thinking. So it it can get you in that materialism much more, that external seeking for validation, which could drive you to hedonistic pleasure, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is all connected. So it's like, yep, not going to say it too many times. So extremely low extroversion involves solitude, quiet, minimal social interaction. Again, that's also why females are likely higher in extroversion, because they're more right hemispheric. They like relationships, and they live in that hemisphere, whereas men seem to be more solitary in terms of maybe not the interactions themselves, but in terms of the relationship. So there's a difference between me interacting with another male for the sake of the system, for the sake of the business, for the sake of that structure, and versus my relationship, my actual, like, us involved in each other's lives, because there's a very different, like, perspective when it comes to somebody who's in a professional setting and how you interact and what that relationship is, or professional relationship, and something that's more of a personal relationship. And that's where the right hemisphere lives. I would say the left hemisphere takes care of those very systematic, business-wise, like direct, systematized logic, rationality when it comes to relationships. So it's very superficial, which is, I would say, your superficial relationships are all the left hemisphere. And that's how it deals with it. So it deals with it as like a transaction rather than an interaction, back and forth. It's just, here's what needs to happen. I need to say these words in this way to get this job done, rather than what is my relationship to them? How do I engage in this in a reciprocal way? None of that matters. It's all about getting the job done. So a low extreme extroversion involves, again, basically social isolation. It would be, I would say this is where it lives in the left hemisphere. So individuals are reserved, introspective, and may enjoy solitary activities. They often thoughtful and prefer deep, meaningful interactions over superficial ones. So obviously, again, it's going to be the opposite. It's like, if you live in this perspective that of the left hemisphere, where let me think for a second. You're extremely low in extroversion, meaning you're not seeking that outward social validation. You're going to want extremely close-knit relationships, because you want them to be important. You want them to be, that's what you're seeking out. And that's why men have much stronger, less superficial relationships, is because that's what they're seeking out. They live in this mind of where it's like systematic, it's professional, it's straightforward, they live in that all the time. So whenever they have an actual relationship, they don't want it to be superficial. They want it to be strong and resilient and have the ability to be a mutually exclusive thing, which is also why I would say men love much more strongly when they interact with a woman, because there's much less involved. It's like, here's what I want. I want a reciprocal cooperative relationship with what I would consider an attractive young woman. And as long as all my needs are taken care of, my basic needs, I can sustain myself in this relationship. And women need much more than that, because they look at that holistic picture of the relationship, and like they take way more into account. They're like, you're not taking into account the aesthetics of the house. You're not taking into account all of our relationships with everyone else. You seem much more isolated than me. I want to go out and engage with other people, even if it's superficial, et cetera, et cetera. So this extreme leads to social isolation and difficulty in forming and maintaining relationships, even though the relationships would be stronger if they formed them. Such individuals may be perceived as aloof, withdrawn, and struggle in environments that require frequent social engagement or teamwork. So it's not to say that females can't be this. I'm just making an extreme case. And this is living in the left hemisphere where men are. So if you make the extreme case for low extroversion, I would say there's more men living there, even though they would have less superficial relationships on average. Okay. So agreeableness. I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit. So high extreme. Extremely high agreeableness involves intense desire to maintain harmony, cooperation, and avoid conflict. Individuals are empathetic, compassionate, and go out of their way to help others and are often seen as warm and kind. Consequences of this, they can extreme to difficulty asserting oneself, tendency to become overly accommodating. Such individuals may struggle standing up for their own needs and be taken advantage of by others. They might be seen as having difficulty making tough decisions that could upset others. So you can almost say they would seem like a spineless individual because they're trying to smooth the waters. Even if it's for the sake of avoiding or dismantling their own principles and what they believe in, because they would rather people not fight than stand up for their principles. And it upsets a lot of people when you're at that extreme end, because people are going to think that you're a spineless coward, and it's something you don't want to become extremely one-sided on. You want to have the other side as well, which I'm going to go over now. It's also why people can take advantage of them so easily. And one of the reasons why people need to be higher in agreeableness is because of that mother-infant dyad, where you need to be gentle with the child. You need to be able to take care of a child, and in doing so, you need to be more agreeable, because the child's going to have needs that you can't disagree with, like when a newborn is of age. And as they grow up, they need discipline instead, which is the opposite, right? You need to be less agreeable with what they're saying. As that child ages, so you go from infinite agreeableness to slowly contracting. And then I would say you don't quite swap, but you integrate more and more disagreeableness as the child ages. And you hopefully have them more or less rounded by the time they're 4 years old, to where they understand the things that you would agree with as an individual and things you would disagree with. And if you don't discriminate between those two, they're going to be very confused throughout their lives at what they should do and what decisions they can make. And it can make them, unstable. So extremely low agreeableness involves a focus on self-interest, competitiveness, and a lack of concern for others. Individuals are often critical, confrontational, and prioritize their own needs above others. They can be very direct and unyielding. And the consequences of this is that they lead to conflict and strained relationships. Such individuals may be perceived as cold, antagonistic, and may struggle to build and maintain relationships or trust with others. They might find it difficult in the environment that they work in, a teamwork and cooperation. So a lot of these people will be at that, they're okay with being in charge, but often they strain their relationships because they're so disagreeable. They won't listen to anyone below them, any other perspectives. And it's I would say it's similar to low openness, but in that, even though you can have a different perspective, let's say I don't agree with anyone's perspective, you don't have to voice that opinion. You don't have to force it on others. And that's where disagreeableness comes in. It's like, if I disagree with you, it's probably at a fundamental level that we're different, and I don't want to deal with anyone that's different than me. And disagreeableness basically says, I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to confront you about this until you either agree with me or we resolve this conflict in some other way. And it's very critical. And obviously, either of these extremes is bad, and you don't want them. And I would say it also probably is the thing that takes advantage of other people as well, because in having that power, and you meet with somebody that is more agreeable, and if they just accept your situation, then you're just able to manipulate them, which is bad. So just look out. If you're highly agreeable, then try to avoid anybody that would try to manipulate you in that way. And learn to stand up for yourself. Learn to integrate this understanding that you're able to be assertive as well. You can learn to be assertive even if you're highly agreeable. Okay, neuroticism. Extremely high. Extremely higher neuroticism involves a high level of emotional instability, anxiety, and susceptibility to stress. Individuals are often very sensitive. These are the characteristics. Worry frequently and experience intense emotional reactions. They may have a difficulty in managing stress and are prone to mood swings. And the consequences of this would be extreme mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and chronic stress, such individuals may struggle to maintain stable relationships and find it difficult to cope with everyday challenges. They might have difficulty in high pressure environments. So obviously this sounds more like women, because I would say neuroticism, high neuroticism, is more of the right hemisphere, because you're connecting so many things. You're going to be less stable, because sometimes you prioritize other things, sometimes you prioritize this, and it's like all of it's living in your right hemisphere, and it's telling you like, hey, you're not considering this other thing. And then when you consider that other thing, then it gives you another thing you're not considering. So it's like one of those things that gives you anxiety, and you need something to ground you. You need something that is stable, structured, and systematic to help you be like, okay, this is how I deal with this problem. And that would be the more rationalistic left hemisphere male way of thinking. On average, obviously, everything's not one-to-one, but it's a way of taking care of that anxiety. Like, and I think that's one of our huge problems, is that people that are very left hemispheric, they ignore their right hemisphere perspective, and this leads to them to that unstable anxiety and susceptibility to stress, because they're ignoring that perspective so much that it drives them to be like this. And it makes sense, because most liberals are female, and if they live in their left hemisphere, they're ignoring all these relationships and other aspects. That's why they change their hair color. That's why they get fat. That's why they don't take care of their bodies anymore, is because they're not taking any of this into consideration. They don't care about relationships anymore. And a lot of that's due to either, males that hurt them. They've learned this rationalistic perspective, which says like, who cares about these relationships anyways? Like, why are you even taking this stuff into account? So in doing so, they give themselves this depression, anxiety, and instability, because they're ignoring their true nature and that aspect of themselves that actually matters and it has meaning. So, and then you have a low extreme of neuroticism, which involves high emotional stability, calmness, and resilience. Individuals the characteristics would be extremely relaxed individuals who are confident, rarely experience negative emotions, and handle stress well and maintain positive outlook. The extreme can lead to a complacency and a lack of urgency into addressing problems. Such individuals may be perceived as indifferent, unemotional, and struggle to empathize with others in emotional experiences. This sounds like a dude, and it's because it is. I would say this trait lives in the left hemisphere, because it's very systematic. It's almost indifferent. It's like, here's the way you deal with this, and I don't need to think about the connectedness of everything, which would make me emotional. So I don't connect with anything. I just kind of like, the rent's due, like, it doesn't bother me. Like, I'll deal with it another day, because I'm still alive now. I'm only taking myself into account. I don't need to think about my connection with the future. I just need to worry, like, I'm alive right now. What do I need to worry about? So it's almost like pushing off all these other aspects that you need to take into account and not taking them seriously. So that would be an extreme of that. And it's bad, because you need to consider your relationship to other people. You need to consider your relationship to yourself in the future, all these things. So a summary, each trait, when taken to extreme, reveals potential strengths and weaknesses. So it will have strengths and it will have weaknesses. And high levels are often correlated with significant benefits, but also notable drawbacks. While low levels may provide certain advantages, but also pose challenges, understanding these extremes help recognize that the complexity and balance needed for a well-rounded personality. So I went over some of the things that are connected to all the other aspects of true dichotomies. And I think it's very informative of the way our minds work. And you can keep connecting the dots until all of it connects. And the next one I'm going to go over is moral foundations theory. So the first thing I need to address is that the 5 personality traits, what they did to create that was they removed all of the notions of good and evil, all the notions of something bad, all the notions of something good from the English lexicon. And what they did was they took all the remaining words and they did a factor analysis. So they condensed it into as few categories as possible that are as related to everything within each category and as little related to every other category as possible. But the thing is everything's so interconnected that there's going to be some overlap. So some things are going to be in other categories and connect with other categories and be similar to the concepts in other categories, but they are maximally different from each other so that we can have these categories. So that's how they created the 5 personality traits. Now, moral foundations theory does that, except it does the opposite. It takes out all the words that don't have to do with good or bad, and it specifically focuses on these things that we find to have a moral connotation, a moral definition, a moral perspective about them, and it reduced it that same way into those factors that are as interrelated and maximally exclusive as possible. So that's Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. And these also, I don't know if they lie on bell curves. I haven't done the research into that aspect of it, but we at least know that each one of these traits is correlated with a specific way of thinking, perspective-wise, of each political party. So then that's what I'm going to try to connect it to and show you the connection here. Because again, if you think about, the main things to think about is that the left hemisphere is very reductionist. It's specific, it's data driven, empirical driven, and it tries to simplify things to one aspect as much as possible, wherever possible. And the right hemisphere tries to expand things. It tries to connect things, and you hold everything as close to equal as possible while still having somewhat of a hierarchy of values, because it's inevitable to have a hierarchy. It's just how much do you consider each one, and do you think that they're all important? So that's kind of the thought to think about. So as stated in the theory of dichotomology, before we can understand any dichotomy that's at play, we first need to rationalize the extremes. So then we understand the full breadth of the true dichotomy that's underlying it. And when it comes to moral foundations theory, care-harm is the first one. So an extreme care would look like an overemphasis on avoiding harm. It could lead to excessive protectionism, potentially stifling personal growth, resilience, and innovation. For example, in societal terms, this can result in overbearing laws and regulations that prevent individuals from engaging in any activities that even pose a minor risk to their health or well-being. So this can manifest in one way when it comes to parenting, by devouring care. By trying to protect everyone from harm, society can hinder personal responsibility and the development of critical thinking and problem-solving skills. It can also create a culture of dependency and entitlement where individuals expect the state and others to protect them from all aspects of life. So this manifests in things like intersectionality. It manifests in things like just the way mothers treat their children. They have to protect them from everything, and they can't allow them to engage with any kind of harm. And this is some of the manifestations of the female nature in our societies as time has gone on, and as they've made their way into the political sphere and into the workforce and into positions of power and getting the right to vote. It's like all these things. It's not to say that it was overall bad. It's just men have had thousands of years to take care of the manifestation of our nature in these systems, and we've accounted for that, and we've negotiated with each other on what's the basis for our relationship within these spheres, and how are we going to deal with each other when things get out of hand. But for women, it's like, how do you argue against taking care of someone too much? You have to have an argument against it before we can try to account for it. And nobody's arguing against it, especially when it comes to liberals. It's like they never tell you when they've gone too far when it comes to how much they take care of you. And this is the whole concept of Big Brother in government. So the more they take care of you, the better they feel. But the worse everyone else feels, because they're not taking all this other stuff like freedoms into account, personal interests. This is also where we get the idea that we what is the other thing? This is where the idea came from, where we were trying to implement affirmative action. That's what it is. So like quotas for specific demographics of people, because we felt like we had to take care of these people so much instead of understanding that they had their own personal choice in these outcomes. That's the issue, is that we need to understand that personal choice is part of the outcome. So when you look at the outcomes, you can't just infer that there was some bias in the system, because there's a huge difference between interests in males and females. When you look at the STEM fields versus when you look at nursing, like much more women go in nursing. It's because they're interested in people, and much more men go into the STEM fields because they're much more interested in things. So we shouldn't, as a society, be like, oh, there's inherent bias in the system and harm being done to both men and women, and that we need to correct for our nature and our personal interests, because we feel like these interests are a result of the society putting pressure on them to be this way. But that's not true of reality. We found that in the Scandinavian countries who've done the most to become egalitarian, the biological difference in interest have maximized in those countries. So it's not society putting pressure on. You can almost say it's the opposite. Society is putting pressure in the opposite way for people to conform to the opposites of what they would personally find interest in. And that bears out in the Scandinavian countries and all the trials and experiments and data that they've gathered from them. Okay, so by protecting everyone from harm, society can hinder personal responsibility and development of critical thinking and problem skills. So it's important to stay away from that devouring care. So extreme harm, this would be the opposite end. It's more obvious, and I'm just going to read through this. I don't think I need to address it really. Neglecting the harm principle can lead to a society of suffering, injuring people who are ignoring people who are injured, prioritizing freedom and personal responsibility over safety or compassion at all. So it's complete anarchy. It's like you have no qualms with anybody being harmed. Therefore, governments can harm their citizens. Businesses can do whatever they want. Leadership can act in whatever way they seem fit to their employees. Like, obviously we have to take those things into account, but it's like, to what degree? And is it a thing that's proactive versus reactive? Like, are we punishing somebody based on something they did, or are we preventing somebody from engaging in a normal freedom which restricts our total understanding of the way the world works and restricts individual freedoms? But so I would much rather advocate for creating consequences when people do things, rather creating the inability for them to engage in something at all. It's like thought crimes. If the outcome shows that there's something bad, then you infer something bad. Those are not the way we should think. Okay. I mean, we should take it into account, but we shouldn't say this is the way you think about these problems. So consequences: without mechanisms to prevent harm, individuals, especially vulnerable people, could experience higher levels of abuse, exploitation, neglect, erosion of societal trust. A lack of care for others' well-being maybe weaken the community bonds and social cohesion, lead to a more fragmented and distrustful society. Long-term instability, ignoring harm, can create cycles of violence and poverty, ultimately destabilizing society and neglecting individuals that may resort to crime or other destructive behaviors. So most people, I don't think, I don't need to argue that side for anybody. So fairness versus cheating. So extreme fairness, maximizing fairness to the point where every disparity is seen as cheating, can lead to enforcement of equality of outcomes rather than equality of opportunity. This approach might ignore individual effort, talents, and circumstances. The consequences of equality of outcome: enforcing equality of outcome can demotivate individuals from striving for excellence and reduce incentives for innovation and hard work. It can also lead to a bureaucratic and inefficient system where resources are wasted in monitoring and enforcing equality rather than being used to foster growth and development. Okay. And you can also utilize it as a bludgeon. You could say, here's these rationalized demographics that I created of my mind, and I'm going to see what the outcomes are. And if they're disparate in any way, then I know there's bias in this system. And that's what critical theory does. And it's a terrible way to think. It's like, yes, you should look at like the outcomes of things. It should be part of your analysis, but it should not be the entire analysis. You should not derive the reason something happened based on the consequence. That's critical theory in general. So you have to look at intent, you have to look at the method, you have to look at people's interests, all these things in combination. You have to look at the whole picture and try to gather as much information as you can to formulate what's going on here. So the consequences of that would be bad. So you'd be monitoring and enforcing equality rather than being used to foster growth and development. So on the opposite end, I don't really need to argue for this either, because everybody knows cheating is bad in general. But extreme cheating in this rationalization would be complete acceptance of disparities. So it's not just that people are engaging in cheating, it's that everybody's accepting cheating as being something that we should strive for. And I would more or less say this is what happened during the whole last century, is like people accepted that being a cheat, being untrue to yourself was something we should do. So they were ignoring other aspects of who they are as a person. With regard to the Nazis and the communists, they were ignoring all these other aspects of reality that they just didn't care about. Like, should we be murdering millions of people for the sake of our pride and arrogance, et cetera, et cetera? So it leads to a highly stratified society. There would be no mechanism to prevent people from taking advantage of others, and psychopaths would decimate civilization, which is exactly what happened in both of those cases. Like, Stalin was his own type of psychopath, whereas Hitler was their own. And there were you could say there are two different systems, but in communism, it is a centralized party that's in charge of the means of production. So all the means of production is centralized to a party or a group of small individuals, and all the way leading up to a hierarchy to the top individual. Whereas socialism is a centralized entity that is governed. So you still have that hierarchy. It's just now it's one step aside from it. It's like you don't actually have ownership of it. The state does, but those individuals are still in charge of that structure, that system. So one is systematized, and communism tries to embody the ownership. It's like this ownership is a part of who we are as a group. So it tries to mix the material world with the side of being. So it's like, here's material, this is attached to these people, whereas all socialism does is separate the two, but it still says they still are in charge of it. So centralization versus decentralization. And I would argue you need to have a mix. It needs to be somewhere in the middle of between those two, but I kind of digress again. So extreme cheating is bad. We all kind of know that. The consequences of this would be exacerbating existing inequalities, creating an environment where few thrive and the majority struggle. Without mechanisms to ensure fairness, individuals born into disadvantaged circumstances would have little opportunity to improve their situation, perpetually cycles of poverty and exclusion. Significant disparities can lead to resentment and conflict, as those who feel cheated or oppressed may resort to protests or violence. So, again, with consideration to cheating and preventing it, it's pretty easy to try to prevent, but in practice, it's much harder. But what we need is people to properly orient themselves towards the equilibrium between these two. Okay, next we have authority and subversion. Extreme authority emphasizes an authority that can lead to authoritarianism, where dissent and individual freedoms are suppressed under the guise of maintaining order and respect for hierarchy. So, as you get more ardent in your left way of thinking, you could become more authoritarian. And when you become more ardent in your religious thinking, you can become more authoritarian. It's almost like, because the book is a document that is structured, you can become more left hemispheric in your understanding of the way that book works in service of your other hemisphere. So you take that holistic notion of the way the world works and you make a framework out of it by which you follow to a T. And anytime you become so strict and ardent and specific about the way the world works, you develop that left hemispheric rational way of thinking, and you become less engaged with your intuitions. So it's almost like in approaching the other, you get the other. So in approaching your left hemispheric way of thinking, you get your right hemispheric way of thinking. And then, okay, sorry about that. So where was I? So yeah, authority and subversion. So extreme authority would have that emphasis on authoritarianism rather than authoritativeness, or being authoritative, or like being assertive and telling people this is how things work. This is the way I understand the way the world works as an individual, rather than it's a centralized entity telling you this is how you should behave. Rather, so there's a difference between a system that sees when you do something wrong and punishes you for it versus a system that tells you how to think, tells you how to be in the world, what to teach your children, what to do, and tells you have to do it. And if you don't abide by this way of thinking, then they're going to punish you. And that's what we're becoming, more authoritarian, having a centralized control over our aspects of our lives. And it's getting worse and worse over time. And we need to make sure we push back against that. And then you have consequences of which could become eventually totalitarian. So the extreme authority would be totalitarianism. Such a system can stifle creativity, suppress free speech, and inhibit social progress. People become disengaged and fearful, leading to society where change and improvement are slow because new ideas are discouraged. People would maximally controlled in every aspect of their lives and exhibit little to no individuality. So you can't infinitely control people to the point where you control every aspect, because you would have to control every cell in their body, every organelle within each cell, every DNA strand, every piece of DNA, everything. And it's impossible to do that level of control because we have no system or possible way to do that. And it would just be impossible. There's always some level of control that you cannot reach, including your thoughts. Like, you can't control every thought people have unless that person wasn't even there. You just replace their brain with something else. It's like, well, at that point, we're not even human, right? So absolute totalitarianism can only be like visualized or abstracted in your brain through rationalization of your left hemisphere. But the closer we get to that extreme, the worse things are going to get. And people need to stop trying to push for this. Stop trying to push for your systematized religion, but let it teach people, let it mold people, let those thoughts filter through other people's heads naturally. Don't try to force it. And then the same for that left hemispheric empirical scientific approach. Like, don't try to force these on people because you've rationalized the way these things work. It's kind of like, there's so many examples I can't even think right now, but don't rationalize a system or a logical framework based on science and say this is how it is. There's always something you're not accounting for, which is why nothing maps one-to-one from a scientific perspective onto people. Like that's why the social sciences are so left. They're all wishy-washy. There's no perfect correlation between anything, is because of these true dichotomies. Anytime you try to pinpoint anywhere on there, you can be right within that measurement, but you're still not taking the whole breadth of the true dichotomy into account at the same time. Okay, an extreme subversion, which would be the opposite. Okay, so this means that society dismisses authority completely. It leads to chaos and breakdown of order and discipline. People would not be able to cooperate beyond kinship and localized tribes. It would in effect become an anarchy. So absolute anarchy. Without respect for authority, society structures and institutions could collapse, leading to lawlessness and disorder. So in an anarchical system, there is no structure. There's no reason for people to engage with each other, because as soon as you form a reciprocal cooperative relationship, then you have some kind of hierarchy of value there. You say, us engaging in this way is more important than not. So in just engaging with other people, you automatically form a hierarchy of values, which is to say that me interacting with you in a reciprocal way is more beneficial than me not doing so. But the next thing you have to ask is, how do we formulate how we should interact? Should it be very informal or should it be formal? And if it's informal, then you're kind of relying on your intuitions and your gut feelings about how you should interact with other people, which could more or less work at an individual level. But as you scale that up to the society, you're going to have so many individual differences between people that are at odds with each other and in contention, taking these true dichotomies all into account, that anarchy in and of itself destroys everything, destroys society, it destroys our ability to form a cohesive understanding of the differences between people. And it would lack coordination. So any large-scale coordination and cooperation would be seen as the enemy. And it would require some level of authority and leadership. Without it, achieving collective goals would become exceedingly difficult, or if not impossible. And this is the same reason why individuals who advocate for a societal structure and government know that we need some kind of centralized entity to ensure we take care of the human aspects, the humanities aspects of our society, whereas the systems should be left up to like free markets. The system should be left up to the natural course between interactions between people who are engaging in under this system and guise of how we should be as humans, the pursuit of happiness, the taking these true dichotomies into account of human personality, etc. So, vulnerable to exploitation. In the absence of established authority, power vacuums can be filled by the strongest and most ruthless individuals. Groups are often leading to exploitation and tyranny. So not only within the groups are there people that can take advantage of this and form a centralized entity by which it would be able to take over the rest of it, but also any external groups like the Genghis Khans, the people who would invade your area because it's so loosely gathered that why would these other people really care about you if you're not under a centralized unity of some kind of system? It's like these people that are like 100 miles away from you, they could have helped come save you from the Huns, but because you guys are so loosely interconnected and it really doesn't, you guys have no meaning to each other besides your personal interactions of your local tribe, which are really what forms your bonds with all the other people around you. Like, you have no way of facilitating protection. You have no centralized government to aid in that endeavor to inform each other that we need to form a cohesive collective to fight against this. It's almost like if your immune system was separate from every other aspect of your body. Like, why would your immune system, like if you didn't have a brain, your immune system's just chilling in there. It's going to protect itself. But why would it protect any other aspect of your body, any of your organs? Why would it attack anything that's attacking another part of you that's not your immune system? That's how anarchy works. It's like it's deforming all these different aspects of humanity into its nascent form where we all started from again. And we have to rise up out of that. So it's not good. Extreme anarchy or extreme subversion is not good. And then you have liberty versus oppression. I think I'm just going to read through these. Maybe I can go over more of them in a deeper level, each their own video. So you have liberty and oppression. Extreme, maximize liberty to the extent where there's little to no the governments can lead to anarchism. So this is kind of the same as, I would say, similar to authority subversion. But this is the formulation that has to do more with within a system. So it advocates that the system exists. Now, here's the degree to which things affect your liberties or oppress you. So maximizing liberty to the extent that there's little to no governments can lead to anarchism where there's lack of basic security and order. This could result in the survival of the fittest scenario, detrimental to societal cohesion and stability. So obviously we need some kind of structures, especially when it comes to guiding our interaction with other people and our preventing of their other individuals' freedoms. And that's kind of where our liberties stop. So they stop with your natural rights. Like I can talk, I can walk around, but as soon as I walk around and I bump into you, or I talk and it forms some sort of problem for you, then we know we've affected each other's liberties in some way. Like I've affected your liberty in that I called for violence for somebody else to punch you in the face, and that's going to affect your liberties. So that's why we don't allow that in our society. Whereas me articulating my ideas in a forum where that's expected, it's like, hey, I believe that everybody should have freedom and equality, and I believe black people and white people should be able to cooperate with each other. And like me stating that is not calling for violence. It's me stating how I think we should all view each other as humans. And not being able to say that would be an impingement on my freedom, because I'm not calling for anything to happen to anybody. I'm just saying how we should all view the world. So we should not get rid of people's ability to have free speech, but there's a limit to free speech, right? Because everything cannot be extreme. You cannot have extremes of any kind, because they're all always bad. So this could result in a survival of that's why libel is also bad. Survival of the fittest scenario where everybody just does whatever they want. Without some kind of structured governance, weaker members of society can be exploited. Public's good, required collective action like roads, education, and healthcare may be neglected, leading to widespread inequality and injustice. Extreme or total repression. I don't know why it says repression. Did I put that? Okay, so total oppression to eliminate liberty can create a highly controlled authoritarian state. The consequences are human rights violations, such as a regime that would infringe upon basic human rights, leading to widespread abuse and suffering. Suppression of innovation, creativity, and progress thrive in environments that allow freedom of thought and expression. Oppression stifles these, leading to stagnation. Overbearing oppression leads to resistance movements and rebellion, which can result in prolonged conflict and instability. So, extreme oppression is bad. I don't think I need to argue that one. Like, there's one side I need to argue for, and there's one side I don't need to argue at all, because it's so obvious. And it's in our society, at least today. Like, I'm sure there was a time in history where it wasn't so obvious that people should have freedoms. Like, I'm sure people are like, what do you mean? Like, we have this system, everybody falls under this, like, Spartan society. It's like, what do you mean people are oppressed? Like, we don't need freedom. We have this perfect system that shows us the way. Okay, so loyalty and betrayal. Overvaluing loyalty can, like, I need to argue this because loyalty never sounds bad. So extreme overvaluing loyalty can lead to nepotism and cronyism, where decisions are made more based on personal experiences than merit or ethical considerations. It might also foster a us versus them mentality, severely affecting societal cohesion. The consequences could erode trust in institutions, as people perceive that fairness and competence are secondary to loyalty. So it's all about that hierarchy of values again. It can also prioritize society, reducing the ability to cooperate across different groups for the common good. And again, that's where the idea or concept of God is. It's like, here's this thing that is outside of all of these philosophies that we need to be subservient to. And I would say God is the understanding that we need to avoid any extreme. Like, that's the first thing you need to do. It's like, as soon as you hold God as the highest value, there's no idea that you can hold extreme, because God is the absence of any ideas. It's something that's outside of our universe. Like, how can you hold God as the highest value and simultaneously become ingrained or an ideologue of it? It's like, what is God? Well, it's like, as soon as I define it, I lose the definition of it. So, and that's perfect, because this concept of God cannot form ideologues around it. Because as soon as you define it, you look somewhere else and there's God too. Like, I've tried to define God in this way, but I also see God over there. So how is this God and that's God? Well, that's because I can't like hold these two things in cognitive dissonance, or like two things that are not true or that are true at the same time, that are opposites. And so it leads you more to that right hemispheric thinking automatically by believing in God. Whereas it's really just, I would say, a true dichotomy and staying away from the extremes. Like that would, and then you formulate where the equilibrium is, and then eventually you get to like the heaven or the homeostasis between all equilibriums that you can come up with. So loyalty, betrayal, extreme loyalty can be bad. We just went over that. So we can read through extreme betrayal, but it's mostly just, it's obvious. There's no cooperation involved. Everybody's at odds with each other. It's more or less what I would consider liberty versus suppression is game theory. It's like whether or not you choose to cooperate or defect. And extreme defection leads to nothing but bad stuff, and extreme cooperation, or extreme, I wouldn't say cooperation, it's extreme loyalty. So extreme ardent cooperation, but you're selecting who. Loyalty is more of a selective process. You're selecting who you're loyal to, whereas cooperation in a broad sense is everybody engaging in some kind of reciprocity at many different levels in many different ways without focusing on the details of who you're engaging with. So treat everybody the same. It's more or less the outcome of that. It's like loyalty is where you're treating a specific entity, group, individual with absolute loyalty. That would be the extreme. Obviously, there's some degree of loyalty you can have to groups, but always consider your individual identity and their individual identity before anything else. Okay. Sanctity, degradation, and excessive focus on sanctity may lead to rigid taboos and the suppression of freedom of expression, especially regarding bodily autonomy, sexual rights, and individual freedoms of choice in matters. Consequences of such approach can lead to scientific research and personal freedoms, leading to a society that is less adaptable and slower to accept beneficial changes. It may also foster discrimination against those who do not fit defined pure categories. So it's like if somebody doesn't fit a pure male or female category, like how I've been rationalizing them in everything, it's okay. It's okay to not fit perfectly neat into these categories. And sanctity and degradation is like, oh, if you don't fit in this, you're just the terrible person and you belong in hell. It's like an overuse of the terminology of hell. It's like, it's bad. And we should love people as long as they're trying to engage in a reciprocal love with us. Like it needs to be reciprocal. And that's what we need to teach them is like, hey, I want to love you, but you have to engage in reciprocity with me before we can both love each other. So you do want to give love, but you can't give love without also receiving it. So just in opening to say like, hey, I'm trying to engage with love with you, in love with you. If you accept it, we can both engage in this idea together, but it's up to you. So in the case of extremes of dichotomies, we can lead to societal dysfunction by stifling individual freedoms. Okay. And then, so that's how sanctity can go bad. And then extreme degradation, rejecting any concept of sanctity and embracing complete moral and cultural relativism can lead to loss of societal values and cohesion. People have no guidepost for path for each other to stay on to prevent people from easily drifting into the from the ideal of equilibrium. So degradation is going towards another extreme in that you're engaging in what I would consider like the concept of anywhere along the true dichotomy is what you think could be a good place. And you think it could be an ideal place for everyone. But that's wrong. It's like saying everybody should be striving to be as tall as possible. And then we all keep pushing that way. Eventually everyone's going to engage in this materialistic aspect where we're all trying to enhance our tallness either through what we eat, our surgeries, all these other aspects of humanity that could be at the detriment of every other thing that we have because we're holding this value as the only thing that's important. And it leads to moral decay, cultural fragmentation, and decreased quality of life. So this is how these are the aspects of humanity and personality and psychology and how dichotomology has what it has to offer, our understanding of them. So now that you more or less understand the differences, I may have not perfectly articulated everything here, but I've at least laid the foundation and the framework for understanding the interconnectedness of this with dichotomous theory, and how each one of them lies on one of these bell curves. And if you just imagine this x-axis is the dichotomy, the true dichotomy. With, see these extremes over here, they are impossible. So if there's no human that has been to these, like, what is the most neurotic human? What is the least neurotic human? Now abstract one over from it, and you've now rationalized the most extreme person, what they look like, because it's impossible to have that kind of person, because there are people that take other things into account. They're not always in this state of depression and state of anxiety, etc., in terms of neuroticism. But it's just to say that you need to understand that extreme to understand the true dichotomy at play. Okay, I want to thank you guys for listening. This was a long video, and I'm not sure how many people will watch this all the way through, but I love you guys, and I hope you learned something. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to post it in the comments below. I really want to hear from other people. I want to see what you guys think. See if you have any other ideas where I could be wrong. Like, I do not think that this is perfect by any means. And obviously it's going to be your left hemisphere that's pointing out specific imperfections in what I say. I'm more or less trying to articulate the connections I've made between all these concepts. So it's not going to be perfect. And I may draw false connections sometimes, but I'm trying to get more, I'm searching for that truer and truer reality of the interconnectedness of everything. And that's how the right hemisphere thinks. So I'm trying to lay out a framework and a way to understand it in terms of all the fields of science, mathematics, philosophy, the inner homeostasis of our bodies. There's true dichotomies within us. I have another video on that. So this would be the psychological aspect as far as I know. I don't know of any other true dichotomies within our psychology other than these two. And I would say this covers the majority of how we interact with the world and other people. So if you have any questions about it, let me know if I didn't address something you thought I should. Yeah, thank you guys. I love you.